welcome, Senator Becker. Great to have you on the show.
Good to be here.
Hey,
Welcome.
Eva.
Super happy to have you. Yeah. Hi, Sebastian. Hello, Senator Becker.
So this is a long-awaited discussion. For anyone who follows carbon removals in the US, they will have come across your name for sure. Because, I dare to say you're kind of one of the CDR policy pioneers in the US. And as a CDR policy podcast, there's a lot to talk about today. I was wondering, there's a lot of different things we want to dive into today, but maybe I was actually curious, how did you come across carbon removals? How and why did you decide to kind of make this, I guess, a priority in your very broad spectrum of activities?
Well, I'd say number one, I'm focused on getting to zero, right? We have to get to zero for emissions in California. And then ultimately we need to be removing lots of carbon from the atmosphere. But even to get to zero, we have to remove lots of carbon from the atmosphere. When I started to look at the math, I approached it. I represent Silicon Valley, come from Silicon Valley. So I have a metrics-based approach to say, okay, we have 400 million metric tons of CO2 right now in California. Even our most optimistic projections say we're going to get to 75 million metric tons by 2045. The rest of that has to be carbon removal. Okay, so I started to look around. Well, what are our plans to get to carbon removal? And it turns out we didn't have very many. And then when I was in Glasgow at the COP in 2021, there was a offsite at some baroness's castle. And I said it was like the rebel underground of carbon removal. I thought it was like 50 people in the world who cared the most about carbon removal at the time. And I got to be there and meet with many of them and hear about a lot of the emerging technologies and policies. And that got me excited because they said, we've got a big problem that, number one, we need to solve. And then we've got lots of entrepreneurs out there trying to solve it. So how can we help them?
Well, thanks for the intro where this is coming from. Now, I'm looking at California's plans, and the great thing is that California has actually quantified its carbon removal needs, and not that many countries or states have done so. And the numbers need to ramp up quite dramatically from 7 million tons by 2030 to 75 million tons by 2045. So what is the current plan to go about it? And also, is this something that is seen as a complementary tool to emission reductions, in whatever context, or is it really something to be used as a last resort only to balance hard to abate sectors?
Well, I think there's still a lot of education around carbon removal, and even explain to people carbon removal versus carbon capture, right? And carbon capture has some folks, mainly the environmental community and others, but who are skeptical of carbon capture, and is that more of an excuse to pollute, or does it work? And so we really have to do a lot of education. Even the point that I just said is not necessarily accepted or really known by all my colleagues, and we always have a lot of new colleagues every year because of term limits. But we always say, I say, there's no net zero without carbon removal. And so if we have a plan to get to net zero, it has to include carbon removal. So number one is just educating people, even on those sort of basic facts and sort of the state of where we are today. And then you get into the point of, okay, well, how can we actually get there? But I think most people, there are still some people who see anything carbon removal or carbon capture as sort of a license to pollute. And we have to continually push back and say, no, this is, even our most aggressive, even though our most regressive carbon reduction plans say that we will need carbon removal.
I think an interesting way to go through to guide us through this podcast is as well kind of looking at the bills that have been introduced on CDR, of which you, for many, were the author, right? Or the sponsor. So should we start with SB 308, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, I believe, that has a really interesting story because it was first proposed in 2023 and didn't make it through. Then in 2024, and it didn't make it through. And I'd love for you to talk through the history of it, and I guess what you learned from it, because I'm sure there were so many learnings from these 2 years of working on this bill.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you learn is, even though we haven't passed, you still influence the debate, and we influence some of hopefully what CARB, our agency, or our the kind of main lead agency is working on here. But yeah, 308 had two main points. Number one was what should count. So emphasizing that we need real removals, not just avoid emissions, standards for durability, hundreds of years. Um, and the goal was a set of technology neutral criteria that let the market compete to find the best approaches. And we also included the concept over time, we developed the concept of a two-phase credit because we do want to support nature-based carbon removal. And there's a lot of um, interest in nature-based carbon removal. I actually just spoke at our Natural Resources Agency, had the first ever conference on nature-based carbon removal and nature-based solutions for carbon recently. So we included the notion of a two-phase credit. So you could use a less durable form of removal that was guaranteed for, say, X years, e.g. a forestry offset for net forest growth that would guarantee 50 years, followed by the purchase of a more durable credit at the end of those years. So this combo might cost less than durable credit immediately, while also providing funding for some of those less durable pathways. So that was the first part is what should count. Second part is how do we scale up demand, right? Which also gets this the question of who is going to pay for it. So for that, we modeled it on the RPS. The RPS is when you look at what's really been responsible for CO2 reductions in California, it's really been the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, where we said to utilities and load-serving entities, you have to have a increasing percent of your portfolio that comes from zero emission sources. So originally it was 5%, then which they thought we never hit, then 15%, 30%, 50%. Now we have a 60% goal for that by 2045. And so we 60% by 2030. So anyway, so that's been an increasing goal and it's been very successful. So we modeled it off of that and said, hey, okay, well, if we need 75 million metric tons by 2045, let's take 1% of that and have polluters purchase that in 2030 and then ramp it up over time. So the idea is to send the right price signal. And by 2045, the cost of CDR would essentially be the price of carbon, creating a clear incentive to reduce emissions, except in cases where the cost is higher than the cost of high quality CDR. So that was the first version of that. As you can imagine, we already we do have a cap and trade system now we call cap and invest. And so polluters pay a lot for the right to pollute, and they don't want to pay any more. So they have not wanted to pay more to purchase carbon removal as well. And there are other obstacles, but mainly the polluters themselves. And so we then really started to focus on the quality standards while deferring. So the second version of the bill, we focused on the quality standards, but we deferred to CARB on the exact mechanism, figuring that they are trusted somewhat, to figure out what that mechanism is. So that was the really the first 2 years of 308. And it was very frustrating because the second year we got very close. We made it all the way through the Senate, all the way through the assembly process, and then it got stuck at the very last hurdle in the assembly.
I see. And I mean, fascinating journey and so much to learn from it. But if there is kind of one takeaway from these years you worked on this bill, the different iterations and the engagement with different stakeholders, what has resonated the most in California when it comes to getting support for scaling removals? Yes, the bill was eventually vetoed, but what have you seen work the best in your experience?
Well, I think we need trusted messengers who come from the environmental space. Remember when I was working on 308 and getting it out of the Senate, one of the legislators said, I don't really understand this, but I trust you. And so I think we do need, because we're always going to have opposition from say people on the right, broadly speaking, polluters who don't want to have to pay for this. Ultimately, somebody has to pay for this. But if we don't have support on the left, then we're really in trouble, right? If we don't have support on the left or the right, then it's problematic. So I think we really need, people who are strong environmental voices, strong emissions reduction voices, to also carry the mantle of CDR. Because again, we can't be fighting both sides at the same time.
This is something that I found rather surprising from kind of following SB 308, is that it gathered, especially in the first year, resistance from the right and the left. It seemed that in the first year, kind of a lot of people were against it that would rarely agree on something, but they seem to be against this bill. And that brings me to kind of the more recent past, where we had SB 643, right, which Senator Caballero sponsored, but that was kind of also another CDR bill in 2025, right? That was going to build a purchasing program, a $50 million purchasing program for removals. And it seemed to have learned a lot from SB 308. It had a lot of support from a lot of different stakeholders. But then again, it got vetoed by the governor, right? So I'm wondering if you can kind of reflect on, we're going to get to the stuff that was passed, because there's a lot of exciting stuff as well, but maybe focusing on that piece as well. What happened there, and what are the lessons you think from the 2025 bill?
Well, I think there it's also, we also need the agencies to be on board as well. And, and sometimes with environmental laws, particularly in California, we face the challenge of folks who say, just leave it to the agencies, right? And especially, you may have a governor, the governor appoints the people in those agencies. So sometimes there's a battle between, not a, battle sounds like a strong word, but between the legislators who are saying, hey, this is the direction we want to go, and the agencies and maybe the administration saying, hey, you know what, we already have a plan. We got a plan. Let us execute our plan, right? So that ends up being a tension somewhat, especially if you're not, if the legislators are not 100% aligned with the agencies. The governor, any governor, tends to sort of side with the agencies. So that's a little bit of what happened, with that one. Because at the same time, I had SB 285, and like the version 2 of 308, focused really just on the quality standards, trying to really introduce the like-for-like concept into that definition. The idea is that the source of the emissions matters, because emissions from fossil fuels, released from rocks and they making cement or whatever, that was previously stored for millions of years. So those emissions must be balanced with removals that also have long durability. So again, that's sort of floating on the quality side. Um, and so we were, working, I don't want to say against, but with sort of folks in the agencies who say, no, don't worry, we got this. We have our own process. We're going to figure it out on our own. And so that's something, as we talked about, we got to get people on the left on board, the left and right, but also people in the agencies on board as well, and make sure that we're aligned.
So you mentioned California's Cap and Invest program, or basically the Californian emission trading program. In the EU, we're looking a lot at incorporating removals into the EU emissions trading system. The UK is looking at bringing removals in. There are some other countries looking at this. Where are things in California?
Well, again, I propose my own thoughts on how best to do that. But CARB, our California Air Resources Board, has said that we should let them work it out. And that's really was the resolution in the Cap and Invest program. So CARB is now working on updated rules. So we extended the program out to 2045, which is great. So we do have now a Cap and Invest program that goes out to 2045, and we're working on, hopefully, on syncing up with Washington State, with British Columbia, or with Quebec, actually, and then ultimately, hopefully, Oregon as well. So we have a real larger market there. But as they're updating the rules, they say they're looking at ways to use the market to incentivize CDR. So again, that's sort of where we are. They've told everyone we should let them work it out. So we're waiting to see what they come up with right now.
And I'm interested in this because after the veto last year by the governor on SB 643, a lot of people were upset in the CDR community, but others were actually pointing to the Cap and Invest program and to the bills that were passed by the governor in the same cycle, and just said, look, but there's a huge success because actually we got, and let me just look at the name, we got SB 840, which is a revolving 85 million kind of climate innovation fund every year, which is supposed to potentially flow to carbon removals from what I understood. And then one that I've also found very interesting, the AB 1207, which is tasking CARB to develop protocols for CDR for the integration to compliance market, which sounded a lot like your previous bill, the 285 one. So I'm wondering, when you look, again, because I can't make sense of it, I'm not in California, right? I heard people being very upset about not one bill not progressing and others who said, actually, we made a lot of progress and this is great for CDR. So what's your assessment of what actually came out of last year's cycle?
Well, again, like I said, well, a couple of things. Number one, as you mentioned, the fund, the innovation fund, and there certainly is an intention and strong interest of many of us in the legislature, which also includes, by the way, from the Senate and the Assembly, we've had strong champions there with Assemblymember Kati Petrie-Norris, who remains the chair of energy in the Assembly. And Assemblywoman Jackie Irwin, who's now running for Congress, our friend, to have that used for CDR. Now, again, it's not set in stone, so we have to now, go and now that money's been approved, to say again, we want that money to be, or some of that money to be used for CDR. So again, strong pot of money that can be used for it, but we have to make sure, again, it will be used for it. And then there's authority, as you say, to go out and for CARB to develop these standards. And again, they're saying, and they've said, to us for years, hey, trust us. We're working on this. We've sort of got this. So at this point, we really need to wait and see what they're going to come up with. And that's why we're not running a bill this year, or I'm not running a bill this year on CDR. We're going to give them time. We have a new CARB leader who's fantastic. Lawrence Sanchez comes from the Newsom administration. So we've got some new leadership over there. And so that's really where we are right now. Both on the dollar side, again, there's money that can be used for it. We need to push and make sure that we do want some of that money used for CDR. And then on the quality and standard side as well. So, but again, we have to keep pushing. When I went to give my speech at the Nature-Based Solutions Summit, I had a pretty edgy speech about durability and additionality, and this is, again, nature-based solutions broadly. And so I, worked with Wade Crowfoot, who's the secretary over there for many years of natural resources, and he said, this is good, but this is like a 301. We need kind of the 101 version. So we toned it down a little bit, but still really focused on additionality and durability, because there's some, who in the environmental community, right, they just want nature, any nature-based solution's good, right? They just want money going towards things that are going to, broadly speaking, conservation and all those things, which are great and things that I support. I now chair natural resources, so I have a lot of interest in that. But again, when we're talking about carbon removal, we have to have that additionality and that durability and really try to convey that to people. Otherwise, we're not advancing towards our net zero goals.
So it's great to hear about the innovation funds, but of course I understand there's work still to be done to make sure that it's used for removals. And I'm just thinking, yes, we need obviously the rules and standards to be in place, but at the same time, we also cannot wait. Meanwhile, we need to attract the private investment so that the projects will actually start being built on the ground. Is there anything going on also beyond regulation where California is doing something to attract investments? I'm sure there are a number of potential project developers also here in the audience who would want to know, like, what could California offer and how could they attract them? Any kind of incentives, public-private partnerships, anything else that is worth mentioning?
Well, we're thinking about that right now. Don't have a lot of concrete. I mean, concrete, carbon removal is always a joke. Concrete, no. But we, nationally, we're also fighting against the toe of the Trump administration, which you wouldn't think would necessarily be anti-CDR, but they really just been anti-everything in the environmental space. And so they shut down, turned off money for a number of different projects really across the country in the CDR space. So that's another undercurrent that we're fighting now. At the same time, we still have, again, many of the entrepreneurs here, and we're really grateful to the private sector, companies like Microsoft, Stripe, and others who have stepped up and have funded a lot of the pioneering carbon removal work. And so I think that's really the key, especially over the next year or two. How can we make sure that these entrepreneurs are still incented and encouraged? Because I'm sure they could be working on lots of different things. How do we make sure that we try to help carry them through this sort of somewhat darker period, right? And again, the voluntary markets, the companies have really continued to step up, despite, again, against sort of the headwinds from Washington. And I'm looking for ways, how can we help here in California too? There are a couple other, more detailed things, but there is CARB's also working on regulations to implement SB 905, which passed a couple years ago, which is focused mainly on geological sequestration rules, but does give CARB pretty broad authority over carbon removal projects. And the legislature also ended the moratorium on CO2 pipelines last year. And that was really important. We were hoping that the Biden administration was going to have rules on CO2 pipelines that we would just adopt. Didn't happen. So we ended the moratorium, and that's something that could have been very controversial in the past, ended up not being very controversial last year, gave the state fire marshal the authority to create pipeline safety standards, which could then allow people to start using CO2 pipelines to deliver captured CO2 to sequestration sites. So there's a number of other important foundational things going on in the background right now that came out of last year. But to your question, it's very much, a number of those companies are in my office, not my office, in my district, companies that are working on ocean alkalization, companies, that I saw at COP in Belém, that are working on, other solutions, enhanced rock weathering, other things. So those which we knew are plans that are measurable. So we need to also try to get some of our universities, our great UCs, and here at Stanford, we're fortunate to have Arun Majumdar, a former head of ARPA-E. That's our innovation center we set up at the federal government. He now runs the Door Center at Stanford. He's been very supportive of CDR, recognizes CDR, has been trying to be helpful there. So I think between the academic centers and the voluntary markets, and then trying to see what we can do with the state government as well, both for speeding up projects too, because we don't want projects to take 10 years, which sometimes can happen. We call cutting the green tape here in California. So there is a lot to do, and it's one of my goals in the next month or two to really start talking, reach back out to some of the entrepreneurs and see how they are feeling and faring in the current world we're in.
And you mentioned earlier, obviously, what the Trump administration has been doing and what the impact it had on some of the projects. And last Friday, the endangerment finding repeal, right? Like there's a lot happening. And where I'm curious about your thoughts is, obviously Governor Newsom in California is really trying to position himself as kind of the antidote to Trump in many ways, right? And I'm wondering, how does that play out when it comes to climate policy? CDR, but also climate more broadly. Is that good for climate policy? Is it not really a topic right now? I'm curious for your thoughts in that bigger picture of what's currently playing out.
Yeah, in terms of the governor, the governor has been a big supporter. He helped get Cap and Invest over the finish line, which is terrific. We are, again, fortunate that the governor has been supportive of these efforts. But again, now that we have a new CARB leader in place that he put there, someone who's very close to, who worked closely with him, now we have to sort of follow up and get this high on his radar screen because, again, you can't be an expert in everything. Nobody can be an expert in everything. There's lots going on. And so, I texted him very much directly during the 308 pieces. So, I need to keep reaching out to him. Others need to keep reaching out to him and to put this high on his radar because again, he's got a lot to contend with, especially fighting with the Trump administration on top of all the other issues and things we have going on here in California. So it's really incumbent upon myself and the rest of the community to keep putting it high on his radar.
Yeah, a very, very important work right there. So slowly trying to wrap up here. Looking forwards, 7 million tons by 2030 that is very soon. That is in 4 years. So I understand a lot what will happen when it comes to removals in the coming months. Potentially the next year will be done by CARB. So the work on the standards, looking at removals, integration in compliance markets. Then, of course, there's this adjacent work, making sure that the innovation fund is actually, those funds actually used for removals as well. What else is in your focus now, looking at this coming timeline? What is
Well, I think what I
important to
really
pay
need to
attention
do,
to?
I also met with again, we talked about the scientific community. It's not just Stanford, of course, Lawrence Berkeley and Lawrence Livermore Labs. There's folks there who are very, have been putting a lot of time and effort into CDR from perspective of the science, but also in how do you bring communities along, right? How do you educate communities and do the community engagement around these projects to avoid any misinformation and get people supportive of these projects. 'Cause ultimately, as with any project of these size, we need to get communities um, on board and supportive. So I think it's really, what I really want to do here. We're sort of just finishing some of our other bills for the year and getting them in the hopper on a whole bunch of other topics. But what I want to do is really we need to do I think a state of CDR. We need to do some kind of paper that I work on with some of those folks at Livermore and Berkeley, say it's like that I can share with my colleagues, where are we right now? Because again, you can't be expert in everything. This is a confusing area like many other areas are also, and there's also a lot of hot buttons. So I think that's really the next step, I think, is to kind of put together that, where are we right now? What do we want to happen this year? And again, along with all the basics of why is this needed? What are some of the innovations? Why is this important to California? And so I think that's sort of one of the next steps, so we can make sure we're all on the same, that the CDR advocates are on the same page moving forward.
Excellent. And maybe as a final question, because again, there's many international policymakers from all over the world who listen to this show. You've been working on this since Glasgow. You said at the beginning, right, to bring us back to that. What would you, like, if you had one piece of advice to any policymaker who's starting to work on CDR today anywhere in the world, what would be your piece of advice to them?
Well, I'd say number one, let's sync up. Let's work. We have to. Number one, we have to just keep focusing on those two questions of quality standards. Number one, and then how to incent the market and who's going to pay for it. So let's keep really focused on those two things. Let's share learnings. It was great at being at COP. That we had the first ever pavilion on carbon removal. I get to be on a panel, sweating it out with many other carbon removal advocates around the world. But this is very much a global fight, and we've got a lot to learn from each other. So reach out to me, my team, and others. Let's make sure we continue to sync up, and let's keep focusing on those two things. And let's share the successes, because there are a lot of successes. Again, we're there with Brazil, in Brazil, which has a lot of capacity to do this kind of thing, and we had one of the key folks there. So let's keep sharing the successes and the progress, as well as syncing up on the issues and problems.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think today's episode played a great part in that. So, thank you so much, Senator Becker, for joining us today. And I think let's wrap it up there.
Okay. Thanks everybody. Keep the work up, and keep going. Let's keep going.
Thanks.
Thank you for all your work.
Bye-bye.
Bye.